Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. And welcome to today's webinar titled Cell and Gene Therapies, Beginning with the End in Mind, featuring three speakers who will discuss how early stage planning, taking into account commercial production, logistics, reimbursement, and health inequities, can lead to successful approvals and market adoption. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's event, Magnolia Market Access, for making it all possible. I'd now like to take this moment to introduce the panelists participating in today's session. Dr. Pamela Landsman-Blumberg is a Senior Vice President of Real-World Evidence and HEOR Strategy at Magnolia Market Access, and is an industry-recognized subject matter expert in real-world data evolution and real-world evidence generation. Our second speaker is Amanda O'Hora, Senior Vice President of Reimbursement and Market Access at Magnolia Market Access. She's an industry leader in the areas of reimbursement, manufacturer, patient support services, health policy, and market access for payers, providers, and patients. Our final speaker is Ajay Keshava, the Senior Vice President of Commercialization Strategy with Magnolia Market Access, who has over 20 years of experience both in industry and management consulting, covering all aspects of cross-functional development, approval, and launch of drug, device, and combination products. Without any further delay, I am pleased to welcome Ajay to the floor.
Sure. Thanks very much, Sydney. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Sydney said, whether it's your morning, afternoon, or evening, we look forward to kind of spending this next hour with you, just sharing some thoughts from our perspective on just where the cell and gene therapy industry is currently, some thoughts around what will improve, just the chance of success in terms of commercialization. With that, we're grateful that that you're spending this next hour with us. So we want to make sure that there are clear kind of objectives and outcomes to come out of this. What we're looking to do is firstly, just to understand just what are some of these commercialization factors. What are we hearing from industry, from payers, from others about just where the industry is at and what kind of potentially needs to change to make cell and gene therapies more mainstream in terms of their uptake. What we'll do is we'll also review some of the changes in reimbursement. Obviously, as great as the science may be in any kind of new product, ultimately to get the drug or therapy in patients' hands comes a lot down to, is it being reimbursed and how is it being reimbursed? And all of those factors is what we will we'll cover in the second part of this. That's what Amanda O'Hora will be covering. Finally, we'll look to examine some of the implications of social determinants of health. So what we mean by this, and as many of you may know, just when you think of the cost of cell and gene therapies, like there are some ethical considerations, just who actually has access to these drugs, right? If they are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, as great as the science may be, can the right people actually get access to the drug in a timely manner? So what Pam will do is also just look at, like some of the data that we already have about who is getting access. Then we'll also just think about what potentially needs to change, either from manufacturer's standpoint, from the overall health system standpoint. So this is what we are hoping to cover today. And so what we'll start with is just a quick overview. I know there's over, I think, 100 people on the call. It could be of varying levels of experience within cell and gene therapy. So just like, what does it even mean? To then some of those commercialization considerations that I was mentioning. So firstly, just kind of what is a cell and gene therapy? So when you think of cell therapies, they aim to treat a given disease by either restoring or altering certain sets of cells, or by using the actual cells to carry a particular therapy to address a particular health problem. What a gene therapy aims to do is also it's aiming to treat disease, but by replacing, inactivating, or potentially introducing a gene into the cells. And this can be done either in an in vivo or an ex vivo setting. And for cell therapies, that I mentioned earlier, the cells could either be your own cells, which is what we've seen more prevalent to date, or potentially through donor cells, which is an area that we'll also talk about, because that could potentially help with just access, where it's not just a one-to-one relationship. So at a high level, I think there's been widespread optimism and agreement that there is a certain transformative power with cell and gene therapies. You're now using actual cells to potentially treat disease is exciting. And when you look at just where the industry's at, like there's over 30 products that have been given FDA approval, and over the last like 5 to 6 years, if you just look at some of these products, one of the areas that that most people recognize is that they're usually treating some type of a rare disease or starting in relapse refractory indications, which again is not kind of that uncommon. Even with like small molecule developments, often it can be in a relapse refractory and then expand as more experience has come, has been made with the product. But this just kind of gives you a sense of just, to date, while it is a generalization, it's probably accepted that most are treating kind of a smaller N, a smaller overall patient population with what has been approved so far to date. So to understand why we've kind of titled this as planning with the end in mind, is because of, if we think about just what does it take to now kind of expand these into broader indications to become more mainstream, the fact that it's something that it's still being worked through obviously means that there are challenges to be addressed. Now, I'm not going to go through like every one of these that's on the wheel, but there are just certain things like a lack of standardized processes. So when you think of using one person's cells is basically leading to that drug product, even to kind of standardize like what does a CMC, chemistry manufacturing controls kind of package within an NDA need to contain, or need to contain in order for regulators to have confidence that that the process is consistent irrespective of of who the patient is going to be. Things like patient recruitment, right? So when this cell therapy means that you are obviously coming in, if it is an autologous product, to have cells removed in some type of a clinical environment. Potentially, if you're coming for a clinical trial, you're having to come back to the center maybe 4 times, 5 times over the course of a trial. So even for patients to be okay with the process, especially if there are other therapeutic options available, means that these types of logistical challenges, and again, this we'll get to come with some of those social determinants, right? Maybe some patients, just while they need the drug, just can't get to an academic institution that is like 40, 50 miles away. So these are just some of those high level challenges, even uncertainty with supply chains to get the raw materials to start the manufacturing process. And also just some of what I was saying, even that ties in from patient recruitment, just ties into the patient burden, right? Like just what is the patient actually needing to do in order to access these therapies is something that, when you think of just small molecule development and you are popping a pill, for example, or even these days with, self-injectables, they are relatively convenient. Just, are we at a point where cell therapies, if everything else is equal, safety, efficacy is all equal, can cell therapies be at a point where that convenience element is on par? So if patients have a choice, they're like, what, yes, like there is a curative element to this, or like I actually want this cell therapy. And just finally, from a report that Deloitte had published, just about some of the top concerns that biotech industry leaders are seeing. Firstly, from just a raising capital perspective, there are macroeconomic factors here. Interest rates are obviously very, very high now also, and the VCs may have other options in terms of where they want to place their money, but also just from partnerships. And that kind of ties into the last point about just undertaking commercialization efforts. Companies looking to see, hey, who has certain manufacturing capabilities that we can leverage in order to move our science forward. Secondly, reimbursement challenges. And this is what Amanda will get to. As many of you know, the cost, the price point for many of these cell therapies is significantly higher, running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And to get reimbursed, to have confidence that the value is there, right? These cells are either, leading to significant remission or curing, therapy, that payers need to feel confident in that. Manufacturing capacity. So here's where, ensuring that your GMP suites have, capacity really to be making these cells in a timely manner. So it gets back to patient, how is it things being cured through each process step. Finally, just here, they're undertaking independent commercialization efforts. So just if you think, if it's not as much of a challenge, just independently going through like phase 2, phase 3 scale up for small molecule development, these days, even with biologics, just what are those concerns that as a broader industry just need to be addressed within the cell and gene therapy space? So here's where, if you think about that last point of just like, how are you going to commercialize, right? And you kind of think through the actual steps, like think of it as like a vein to vein process. So cells potentially being extracted, cells are being modified, cells are being reintroduced, right? So just what kind of needs to change here? So, like any product now, there's a referral, an evaluation, and approval. So, doctors thinking, yes, this is the right therapy for this particular, a need at this point. Within the cell and gene therapy space, there's then the ordering of these cells, right? So it's not like there is, drug product with 12 months of stability that's on a shelf, and, a specialty pharmacy is shipping the product, like there's an additional kind of layers here that need to be thought through, which also goes into the manufacturing and quality control. So if it's the drug product is for one patient, then after that referral is made and the process starts, then just how timely, is the manufacturing occurring? Is, the quality control steps all in place to ensure that, that the product is meeting the right quality standards. The ordering and the intake of the product and the administration and monitoring kind of just closes out from when you are referring, just how the product is getting to patient. And what we wanted to go through here was just like, what are some of those things that now need to be thought about that are very specific to cell and gene therapy? So, and especially keeping in mind, when I said like, keeping the end in mind, if you're thinking of a broader indication, what do you need to do that now your cell and gene therapy is kind of front and center in a physician's mind when they've got many alternatives that they could be prescribing? So just thinking through the process and timing of referrals relative to the disease progression. So if a patient is on, some background therapies and now, disease is progressing, just what is the process? Are they going to continue on background therapy? If you now go through the process of, approving cell therapy, between the time when we go to ordering, collecting, and shipping, just what are those wait times from a manufacturing availability perspective? When we think of cells, you can think of both fresh cells where the viability of the cells is likely to be higher, or it's cryopreserved cells. Obviously, just from a storage perspective and how long they can last will more likely than not last longer, but that often that can mean that just the number of healthy cells can decrease in a cryopreserved environment. So, and just logistically, does everyone in the process have, if there's a cryopreserved, like, a fridge that is validated at minus 70 degrees, all of these types of considerations need to be thought through. When you think of manufacturing, as I mentioned earlier, like one of the differentiators with cell and gene therapies is just the upfront cost, right? Scaling up in small molecule development, like phase 2 to phase 3, like there may be, ramping up from the size of a fluid bed dryer or something like that. Cell and gene therapy upfront, the cost for equipment is significantly greater. So it's there that, like, are there partners, like some type of a external manufacturing center, where they have GMP suites, they are experienced with cell and gene therapy manufacturing. Then what types of capabilities do you want to keep in-house? What are you going to kind of put in the hands of a third party? And finally, even, if they are to become more mainstream, do you need to get to an academic institution? Like, is a decentralized kind of point of care manufacturing an approach that is cost effective, and is scalable for a chosen therapeutic area? Finally, with ordering and intake, as I said earlier, when you think that it's just one kind of drug product per patient, just ensuring, there's clean and clear chain of custody with the appropriate the data security, the quality risk management that needs to go in. So from a labeling perspective, ensuring that patient's cells throughout the process of manufacturing are properly kind of, identified and are secure. All of these things, if you think of as an established a pharmaceutical company that even may now be thinking about a cell and gene therapy business unit, the quality departments may well be well established with processes, SOPs in place, but just the level of rigor that's needed when there are so many touch points, even there, the kind of thinking through that, planning with the end in mind, and what does this mean for other departments within, a company, it all needs to be thought through. Finally, from an administration and monitoring perspective, is this in an inpatient or an outpatient setting? And obviously, those have an effect on reimbursement that my colleague Amanda will soon talk about. And if it's a new therapy, the time frame for post-administration monitoring, is the durability of the cells there? Is there kind of be, if you're thinking it's curative, for example, and it's a one and done, or, you need a certain number of administrations, just what does that kind of mean from a monitoring perspective? So these are just some factors that, there are many more, but, in the interest of time as well, just to kind of that a potential company, that wants to be in this space should be considering. What I'll do just to end is kind of just to go through some type of a case study where, and the case study I've given is in IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. So here's where, this is a disease affecting approximately 1.7 million people in the US. Even with that many, and with the number of therapeutic options that I've, just shown in that diagram, it's kind of well known that there's still suboptimal disease management is kind of prevalent. Doctors, patients tend to cycle through therapies, when the efficacy wanes, then kind of move on. And biologics right now are the preferred modality for moderate to severe patients. Some of you that follow like what's happening in the industry may have seen that Roche acquired a product from Roivant in IBD, kind of for a very expensive amount, while it was still in phase 2 development, just showing that, there's still a lot of kind of interest in, even before, potentially getting to a biologic, right? Between that steroids and biologic, is there a different type of mechanism of action that could, help patients? So just kind of knowing this, and ultimately that last point, physicians generally want stable patients in this therapeutic area, because failure on these therapies could well mean surgery, right? So these are just things to kind of keep in mind. And I'm giving this example because this is a mainstream disease, right? With patients that are, as I showed, that are in the millions in the US. So, if you think, could a cell therapy address some of these challenges? Now, what I'm showing you on the graph here is that even with those biologics, from the maintenance dosing frequency, to kind of some 4 weeks, some 8 weeks, not many products are hitting a remission rate greater than 50%. Now, if you talk to payers, they will tell you, look, many of the products are kind of a jockeying for position, is a phrase we've heard, right? Now there's biosimilars. So with contracting, with rebates, you're trying to find, to obviously get product to patient. But if there was a safe and durable option that had remission rates of greater than 50%, that could significantly move the needle in this therapeutic area. So if you think of cell therapies, not wanting to get into the science too much, but Treg cells or regulatory T cells, which are white blood cells that regulate your immune system response, could be, some type of a company may think, hey, let's go down the path of cell therapies and let's hit that greater than 50% remission rate. Some of the things just to keep in mind, would be even firstly, like any trial, to establish safety, right? So are you going to do this, establish safety in people with well-established disease? Are they going to be open to trying this, the chance of being on placebo cells? Or could patients who are on a well-tolerated drug add the cell therapy on? And then could they remove other therapies then in order to show the efficacy of your cell therapy? So, there's things here that when you think of planning, just to think through, how are you even going to get those patients to enroll in a trial? And then, as I said earlier, if seeing IBD hits generally a younger population, if patients are okay with self-injecting like some type of a biologic, are they going to be okay, even if your efficacy is higher, to be like, yep, I'm okay with the frequent clinical visits of what I need to do to be on a cell therapy? So it's just to kind of to give you an example of just what are some of those challenges and this type of scenario. I mean, it could be in pulmonary disease where iPSC cells or exosomes going directly to the lung, for example. All these examples, the science could be exciting, but thinking through how does that product get to patient is very important. So just to wrap up here, some of us at Magnolia have come from very innovative biotech companies where we realize that the science generally has to lead in order to do something very innovative. But just thinking of the practicalities of market access early on can save a lot of hardship further down the road. And there could be a certain place where cell and gene therapies fit better. Like, for example, if it's like a non-immunological disease, where the body's not continuously kind of regulating, something like trauma, ischemia, where cells could potentially enter, address a problem, and the durability of the cell therapy is not as kind of significant a problem. And finally, as the industry progresses and you think of, as opposed to a one-to-one with an autologous therapy with your own cells, if allogeneic therapies or off-the-shelf solutions do become more prevalent, just some of those social determinants that we spoke about earlier, or increasing access to all patients, could be areas that the whole industry is able to address. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Amanda O'Hora.
Hi, thanks, Ajay. And certainly I appreciate the polling question and responses, because I agree. I think reimbursement's a very big deal, and accessing products and cell and gene therapies in this market is certainly a huge issue that we still are hearing about. So what I'd like to talk to you about are some of the changes and the trends that we're seeing in reimbursement with regards to cell and gene therapies. So specifically, we did pull some data to look at what the current payer mix is for cell and gene therapies, looking at some of the shifts in sites of care. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the coding updates that are going on in this space, and then finally, what are some of the new Medicaid and Medicare payment models that CMS is proposing, and how those, and what some of the considerations are for you as manufacturers as you're developing these therapies. Because as Ajay mentioned, a lot of times, unfortunately, reimbursement and access are an afterthought, or people wait very late in the development process to really start thinking through some of these issues. And those considerations really need to be started closer to the beginning about how is this going to work, where is my product going to be administered, who's going to be paying for it. So you can start thinking about those issues as you develop and have a good, solid plan when you launch. And also knowing that the environment is changing, so you'll need to evolve and change your plan over time. According to the data, it's commercial payers. Now, again, depending on your individual product and disease state, this may change a little bit. So what we did is we looked at open claims data to see who were the payers for the CAR Ts. And with regards to the CAR Ts, we included Abecma, Breyanzi, Carvecti, Kymriah, Tecartus, and Yescarta. Those are the products that we included in that group. But we also looked at Zolgensma and Luxturna just to give us a little bit more of a spread outside of just the CAR Ts. And as you can see, according to the data, overall, commercial payers are the most significant payer source for cell and gene therapies. But Medicare and Medicaid continue to remain very important, as I had mentioned, depending on your patient population. If you're dealing with a disease that's in pediatrics, Medicaid is definitely going to be very important. If you're dealing in an elderly population, Medicare may be more important. And also when we look at Medicare, a lot of times Medicare will drive or be the benchmark that other payers may use or look to when setting their own reimbursement and coverage policy. So we don't want to rule them out. But I just thought it was interesting that commercial payers still, by and large, are the most significant source of coverage and payment for cell and gene therapies. So what does this mean for you as a manufacturer? Well, it means when you look at your individual payer mix, how is that going to impact your market strategy and your resource allocation? So what kinds of resources will you need to develop for a commercial payer versus a Medicaid or a Medicare MAC? What different kinds of value information, evidence, pricing, contracting policies might you need to have in place that would vary by channel? And then finally, what are the implications for your patient support services, specifically financial? So there's certainly, things like copay assistance and offering copay support to patients. You can do that for a commercial patient. Much more difficult, if not, I don't want to say impossible, much more challenging for a publicly insured patient who has something like Medicare or Medicaid or the VA or TRICARE or something like that. But those are considerations that when you're planning, you need to start thinking about these things early, because that will drive what kinds of support services you need to offer, and then also modeling out based on that, what is the cost of these services to you as a manufacturer? So the next thing we looked at were shifts in sites of care. And we've been hearing a lot of, just innuendo and talk and rumors about, a lot of products that were initially primarily done in inpatient setting are moving to outpatient. And again, when we looked at our claims data to see, have there been shifts in care, the answer is yes. Now, for the most part, the CAR Ts are still primarily being used and administered in the inpatient setting. However, we are starting to see more of an uptake in the outpatient setting, which again, I think is very interesting because it does cause a lot of shifts and a lot of considerations, especially for folks who are in the process of developing a medication. That's maybe their clinical trials are only being done in an inpatient setting. So these are things that we want to consider and look at products on an individual basis, because whether you can use something in the inpatient or outpatient setting can vary. So things like, as I had mentioned, where were your clinical trials performed? Were they only done in the inpatient setting? If so, in the beginning, you may be limited to being used just in the inpatient setting. But as we can see from some of the products shown here, that there has been some kind of shift because the safety factors and concerns may have become less and less. The other thing is you have to keep in mind your patient's overall medical condition. Depending on the health status of your patient, is it safe to perform these in the outpatient setting? And then the other thing is the administration procedure itself. A lot of these products are, when they go back into the patient, are an IV. Some of the products we've worked on have much more complicated administrative procedures where they may be administered intracranially, they may be administered into the spine, they may be administered in other ways that would cause you to kind of pause and stop to think about could this procedure actually be done in the outpatient setting, or is it going to be required to be done in an inpatient setting? But as the data showed, we are seeing shifts to the outpatient side of care. So the considerations here of how is that going to affect things like your pricing? If you move from inpatient to outpatient, certainly things like 340B pricing, Medicaid rebates, those kinds of things become more important to you that you'll need to consider. How does coverage and payment for your product now change? Does the payer now become even more of an important factor for you to consider in your planning process, because it's not just the hospital that's making the decision? And then same thing here. Are you going to need to offer different patient support services, or are those going to need to shift along with where the product is going, because what you might offer a patient in the inpatient setting could be very different than what you would offer them in the outpatient setting. The next thing that we looked at was payment. So historically, we've always, the mantra has been inpatient payment bad, outpatient payment good. But what we've seen in the data again is that inpatient may not be as awful as we thought it is, or once thought it was. When we looked at the CAR T payments, and we were looking at the medians here, we looked at them inpatient versus outpatient and then by payer type. So what we wanted to determine was, is it really as bad as we think? Now, a couple things about this particular data that I do want to note. The information that we're showing here in terms of payments are for the entire encounter, for the entire hospital stay. They are not for just the drug or the product themselves. A couple of other things to note here are, this data does not account for differences in things like length of stay, the overall patient condition, whether there are comorbid conditions involved, what the hospital type is. So if you have a cancer hospital versus another type of hospital that may have different reimbursement scenarios, it doesn't necessarily account for that, because this is just generalized payment information. The other thing I wanted to note is we didn't include Luxturna in this particular data slide because the data was very limited in certain areas, and so we didn't feel comfortable sharing some of that because the counts were very, very low. So again, one of the things that kind of struck me in looking at this was really, it's not as bad as we think it is necessarily in the inpatient setting. Now, certainly when you start looking at the Zolgensma example, inpatient setting Medicaid gets a little tricky when you consider some of the costs associated with administering Zolgensma and the drug itself. Its WAC is currently a little over $2.2 million, and so the payment there is underneath that benchmark by a good amount. But when we look at some of the CAR Ts, for example, with the exception of Medicaid on that side too, on the inpatient setting, it's not too terrible. So commercial payers certainly, Medicare, for the most part, above some of those benchmarks. So it really just shows you if a hospital can negotiate and walk through all the steps that need to be walked through to achieve appropriate reimbursement, they can cover some of their costs. Now, again, the other thing to keep in mind is that costs in the inpatient setting are also generally higher than those in the outpatient setting. So there are some adjustments and considerations that would need to be made. So in terms of the manufacturer looking at some of this and trying to think of, well, what do I do with this? Certainly, understanding how payment scenarios will impact both your pricing and contracting decisions with payers, and how can you support your hospital stakeholders so that reimbursement is not the barrier and not the reason patients don't have access to your product. So that could include things like developing hospital formulary negotiation kits, making sure they have the economic information that they need to have those conversations with payers. A lot of times what we'll hear is manufacturers, when they go talk to like a health system or a hospital, for example, they'll talk to the P&T committee. They might talk to the department head, so the head of oncology or immunology or whatever disease state the product's in, and then they'll go give the code to the billers. But there's some other people that are super important in that health system that also need to be contacted, and that can include IT, your charge masters, your contracting, purchasing, finance. All those groups may need their own information to be able to add this and incorporate this into their processes and workflows. So just keep in mind, your hospital stakeholders may be a little broader than you might initially think, and you need to have a plan in place to address their specific needs and concerns. All right. The next thing I want to talk to you about was some changes in coding. So initially, the AMA came out with a series of codes that described the process to collect the cells, process the cells, and then administer the CAR T cells back into the patient. As you can see, the first 3 steps are not covered, but the third one is. And the other interesting thing to note about the payment there is that it's the same amount that they pay in the hospital outpatient setting for the administration of a CAR T that they pay for another kind of chemotherapy. So it's the same payment amount. Now, initially, the AMA had these particular codes slated to sunset at the end of this year, but they've extended them through the end of 2028, and they will expire beginning January 2029. So this is just an example of how coding can change and why it's so important to keep monitoring things that are going on with regards to reimbursement, because the environment can change. So with regards to manufacturers, and one of the things that you need to think about are, how do the codes you need vary by payer type and site of care? So when we looked at, hey, over time, your product could shift from one site of care to another, and then depending on your specific payer mix, there may be specific codes that are needed. So what are you going to need to do and plan for early on, and how might that shift over time? And then, like the second question says, what might you need in the future? So what's going on right now is not stagnant. It does change. It's important to monitor it, and it's important to make sure that your strategies are evolving as you go along. Then the last thing I wanted to mention were some of the new payment models that CMS has indicated that they're going to create. The first one in blue, the cell and gene therapy access model, is a Medicaid-specific model, where CMS is proposing that they would coordinate and administer outcomes-based agreements with manufacturers for cell and gene therapies. And these could be multi-state agreements. They could be single-state agreements. We haven't seen the specifics from CMS yet to give us the details on what these programs will look like. But overall, what CMS has said is that they're going to be looking at different outcomes-based payment options. And this could include providing a payment up front, and then with remaining payments just being on a set payment schedule. Some of them would be a payment up front, but if the outcome isn't met, there would be some type of rebate offered. And then the last one is, could they look at just fixed prices and payments over time? And all of these are tied to outcomes. So there would have to be some kind of metric or measurement over time that shows that the patient is hitting whatever outcomes are laid out in the proposal. CMS has said they'll start developing the models this year, and then make that announcement next year or the year after in terms of what those models would look like, what the specifications would include, and then the models could launch as early as 2026. The other thing CMS has indicated is that they could start with a product that has a single indication or a single indication overall. And if the product and the program start showing access, outcomes, and costs can improve underneath this model, they would consider adding more indications, more products, and expanding the program in general. So the second model here is the accelerating clinical evidence model, and this one is focused more on the Medicare Part B side. So CMS is basically planning to work with the FDA to identify new payment models for drugs that are approved under the accelerated approval process. And the intent of this is to encourage more timely trial completion and improve access to patients post-market, and to generate more efficacy data. Some of the ideas that they're considering include, or need to account for things like products that have multiple indications versus single indications, or they have multiple trials in progress for multiple indications. So those are some of the factors that CMS said that they would want to take into account when developing this model. Similar to the Medicaid model, they're looking at options with the FDA this year with the intent, and this is very vague and very CMS-like, to say we're going with the intent to launch as soon as possible or as soon as feasible. So we're not sure exactly what that means. Is that 2024? Is that 2025? Is that 2026? We're not sure. It's as soon as they possibly can. CMS did say that they're planning on employing the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking once they develop a model. So again, this is something that as a manufacturer in this space, you may need to be monitoring this so that when these proposals come out, you can comment, you can provide feedback, and let CMS know what you think about the proposals that they have. Do you agree with them? Do they need to be modified? Do you disagree with them? So you just want to make sure that your voice gets heard. So overall, thinking about what's coming, looking for more details, and then determining what the impact these models will have on your existing pipeline, or your existing products, and what you have in the pipeline. So those are some of the things from a reimbursement. Certainly we did not cover every single trend or change in the reimbursement landscape that's currently going on, but I will now turn it over to Pam.
All right. Thank you very much, Amanda. Appreciate it. So a little bit of a change in direction. We're going to be speaking about social determinants of health. Big topic, kind of waxes and wanes, but is very much a topic of discussion in a lot of different areas of healthcare today. So I'm going to show some examples both from clinical trials as well as real world data, some of the data that we have in-house that we've evaluated, and talk about sort of what are social determinants of health. Can they inform cell and gene therapy strategies? And sort of what questions does SDOH raise when you're making various decisions along the development pipeline and the life cycle of the product? So I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly, only because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So thank you, Sydney. So very high level, really, I'll say social determinants of health are the way you are the factors you can look at that will identify if there are health inequities and therefore health disparities. I know this is a pretty wordy slide. So hopefully there's some information in here really for everyone. So the first is that we looked at the same our in-house data, and this is for some of this information actually comes from the published literature, where they were looking at of those that have received adults that have received cell and gene therapy, and looking by race. So numerous studies continue to report these disparities, specifically in some of the especially in the CAR T targeted diseases such as hematologic malignancies. And so some of the things that you can see here, there's some known issues. I think it's that those who are African American and Black have a higher propensity to have multiple myeloma, and outcomes can differ by race. And here you can see that really this is mainly CAR Ts, but there are various patterns of who's actually receiving these different therapies. So you want to think about your clinical trial inclusion, as well as are there other outcomes or other disparities related to race that could impact your trial results or your conclusions. So next we looked, this is from our in-house data, again, that open claims. We linked to a patient-level social determinants of health file that we have to look at if people are married or single. So one of the things with cell and gene therapies, often patients have to travel. You have to be at that site for several weeks. So that could impact, obviously, your maybe your patient assistance programs. How are you going to help? How, as a manufacturer, might you help defray the costs for patients? What are the ways that you can estimate and maybe include some of these costs to be covered in your pricing and economic models? So we found that 1/3 of patients who currently have received cell and gene therapies are actually single, and half of these have children in the home. So once you have children in the home, obviously there's another layer of support that patients will need. Looking at incomes, again, you can see about 1/3 of people are falling in between sort of the median household income and the federal poverty level for a family of 4, so around $50,000. You do have about 1/3 that are over 100,000. But how does household income or even healthcare affordability factor into your pricing options, your contracting structure, or your patient support programs? What if you were shown evidence that even high income households have problems with healthcare affordability? How would that impact some of the decisions that you are making? This was a published study. On the left-hand side, they looked at, from clinicaltrials.gov, they looked at 44 CAR T trials. There were 4,300 patients or 4,400 patients who were enrolled or to be enrolled. There were a mean number of sites of 7.8 per trial. Again, this is in multiple myeloma. So on the left-hand side, you can see where the sites are. On the right-hand side is where African-American population sits in the United States. And it's concentrated down in the sort of the East Coast and the Southeast. So you have to think about putting your trial sites where your patients are. And then quickly, we looked at the geographic location of where patients were receiving care and where they actually lived. These are urban influence codes, which come from the Department of Labor and Agriculture. One on the left are major metropolitan centers with over a million residents. You can see most of where the care is provided. The dark blue line is in those major metropolitan centers. And then even that's where most of the patients currently receiving treatment are residing. So as Amanda was talking about moving to the outpatient setting, how do you look at those patients who are eligible, who are more living in those more less crowded and less areas with academic medical centers, and possibly moving to more outpatient treatments? And are there incentives for systems to deliver these therapies, obviously closer to where the patients actually reside? Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong slide. So just if anybody would like a copy of the slides, please reach out to any one of us and we can get this. I'd like to get to questions, but just again, where and how should you think about these factors in your planning? Which factors are influential to your specific target population access to care and affordability of care? And then how can manufacturers help ameliorate the impact of social determinants of health on patient access and affordability? And with that, Ajay, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Pam. And yeah, thank you, Amanda, as well. Look, we're hoping that just what we've done over the last 15 minutes or so is just to kind of give you that broad overview of just from commercializing, thinking about what does it take to commercialize, what are some of those reimbursement, called challenges for now that just need to be thought about early, as Amanda talked about, codes that are there, changes that the regulatory bodies and payers are making, and what Pam presented about how do you get to a broader population, right? And expensive therapies, while it may not be happening now, what may change and how to further think about this. So with that, we have about 5 minutes to go. We'd like to open it up to any questions from what you've just heard today. And Sydney, to facilitate that, happy to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Ajay, and thanks all of you for wonderful presentations. I'll leave this thank you slide up a little longer so people can jot down your emails, and let's jump into our Q&A session. So first question for today, do CGTs need HCPCS codes?
Okay. I can answer that. The answer is yes. Most of them now do have HCPCS codes. Again, the shift from inpatient to outpatient settings has driven some of that. I will say whether CMS would grant a manufacturer a HCPCS code if they anticipate only inpatient usage, then the product's not going to shift into outpatient. That might make it a little bit challenging. But that's a strategy that you'll need to consider when you're launching, is that if you do intend on moving to an outpatient setting, you would need a HCPCS code, you would need pass-through stats, or some other things that you might.
Okay, fantastic. Next one, just how realistic are allogeneic cell therapies for more mainstream indications?
Sure. Thanks, Sydney, and thanks for the question. I mean, it's something where, from a theoretical perspective, like not going one-to-one relationship, but from a donor cells, like one to many, and then being able to like cell bank, then from that regard, you can say in theory that it's possible. Just some of the challenges that you need to think about is something called alloreactivity. So once these cells that aren't yours are introduced into your body, just like any foreign object introduced to your own body, what are the chances of like some type of reaction occurring that was not thought of, that wasn't seen in clinical trials? That's something, and potentially, like any immunosuppressants you might need to be on allogeneic therapies that you wouldn't when it's your own cells with autologous. These kind of questions just mean that the science continues to progress. For now, for mainstream therapy, that's why you probably haven't seen them. Like the science isn't quite there, but these are the kind of areas that are being worked on by in order to address that problem of just allowing kind of cell therapies to become more widespread and mainstream.
Okay, fantastic answer. Thank you. Just before we get to one last question, perhaps we can squeeze in two. I just would like the audience, if you have a moment and have to jump off before we finish, please provide your feedback on your experience today and let us know what webinar topics you might be interested to see in the near future from Magnolia or HealthEconomics.com. Okay, so our next question. How would more outpatient usage affect my patient support service offering?
Yeah, some of the ways that shift could affect your patient support services offering would include things like copay support, whereas in the inpatient setting, it's difficult to do that because the way the payment mechanisms work in inpatient settings, they don't normally pay for the drug separately from the rest of its day, so it's hard to provide copay assistance. So you would probably have more copay assistance in an outpatient setting. You may also see a change in the kind of case management that you would provide, where if you're in an inpatient setting, there may be a family member or a caregiver or a parent that needs travel, lodging, things like that, that if you're going in and out of the hospital in the same day, you may not need to provide that level of support. So those are just a couple of ways your patient support services could change if it goes from inpatient to outpatient.
In closing, I hope you enjoyed this HealthEconomics.com webinar sponsored by Magnolia Market Access, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.